What's up, gangsters? Time for part 2 of the Tamiya 148 Spitfire Mark 1 build series. And with this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about primer and do a little bit of photo etch and assembly work. So let's get right into it. Okay, so as you can see, I have spent a little bit of time off camera priming some parts. And I'm going to talk more about that, but before I do, let me spend a few minutes talking about primer itself, or really more importantly, which primer I use. I already mentioned a couple of the reasons why primer is good, but picking the right primer is also important. And I stick to really only two primers. My go-to primer is Mr. Surfacer 1500, and it's a lacquer-based primer. It's made by Guns, and it's fantastic. I mix it 50-50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner, and I keep it in a little handy squirt bottle right here, so that all I ever have to do, it's got a little BB in there, all I ever have to do is shake it up and squirt it directly into my airbrush cup. It's ready to go. And keeping it in this little bottle, which this is a polypropylene bottle, and if you use really hot lacquer thinners, you'll get some evaporation through the plastic and your stuff will thicken up. And that'll happen even a little bit with Mr. Leveling Thinner, which is a much milder lacquer thinner, but not nearly as bad. I discovered that this had gotten a little bit thick last night when I went to spray some, so I just added a little bit more, and I just kind of do that by feel. But I always start with 50-50 as baseline. Now, there are people who think that's barbaric and that you can thin your Mr. Surfacer a lot more, and you can. But I like for mine to have a little bit of body, so 50-50 works well for me. Now, that's my go-to primer. It's pretty much what I'm going to use almost all the time. Now, in the other small percentage of times, I want an acrylic primer. And so I use Badger's Stynylrez, which, as most of you probably know, is also branded as Ammo One Shot and UMP acrylic primer. And this stuff is fantastic. It's the only acrylic primer that I've ever found that really approaches the qualities of a lacquer primer. It's super easy to spray right out of the bottle, although it is really thick. It's like crazy thick, and you think it's too thick. But trust me, no matter how crappy or crazy it looks while you're spraying it, it levels out in an unbelievably magical way. And it just works really, really good. It's not quite as durable as a lacquer primer because, of course, it doesn't have that grab that a lacquer primer has on polystyrene. And you really need to give it about 24 hours, but it will sand out just about as well as a lacquer primer. And that's the third most important thing for primer to be able to do, in my opinion. It's got to improve the paint adhesion, it's got to show you the flaws, and it's got to be really nice and sandable. It's got to dust up, it's got to sand really dry, assuming you're not wet sanding. If you can get those three things out of a primer, you're in good shape, and this stuff will do that. Now, why would I use this? What are the circumstances that I would use this? Like I said before, Mr. Surfacer is my go-to, and it's a lacquer primer, so it's not an issue of fumes for me because the lacquer doesn't bother me. But lacquer sometimes will do a weird thing when you're spraying it into tight confines, because it tends to dry so quickly. This is not necessarily a good part to explain it on, but let's say you're spraying down into something like this, okay? What can happen is that when you're spraying down into a tight corner like that, you'll get paint particles kind of ricocheting around in there, and by the time they finally come to rest, they've dried enough that they don't really level out, and you'll get a gritty texture. that's just a thing with lacquer primers. And sometimes, sometimes you can sort of control it by the direction that you spray. That's something I'll talk more about later on down the road. But sometimes you just really can't do anything about it. And this is, this part right here is one of those parts where it could be an issue. Probably not, but if you have that issue and you're going to have that issue just based on experience, then this is potentially a better choice, because for whatever reason, this stuff just does not do that dusting phenomenon. And so it can save you some headache. And that's really what primer is all about, is making your work more efficient and more effective. So this definitely sometimes is a good choice. And it comes in some good colors. It comes in a rust base color, comes in, there's several different colors that can be pretty useful. So anyway, that's the primer that I use, and that's why I choose the one that I do. Now, let's look at the stuff that I've chosen to prime here. And this already will show you some of the stuff that I was talking about before. These little oxygen, or no, they're not oxygen tanks, they're compressed air tanks, are a good example of one of the reasons to go ahead and prime these parts before you take them off the sprue. One of my rules with model building is leave parts on the sprue as long as it makes sense. And the key words there are as long as it makes sense. If you got to take them off, take them off. But if you don't, then don't. And this is a case where I didn't need to. You can see in a couple of places where there was more than one attachment that I clipped, like on this. This is an oxygen tank right here, and I clipped one of the gates off of it before I primed it. And I clipped the one that's going to possibly be visible. It really won't, faces the rear of the aircraft. But the other one doesn't matter. So now I can just, if I need to do a little bit of finishing work on that sprue gate remnant, then I can do that before I move on. But here's what I want to show you. All right, and even with beautifully molded tamiya parts, and these really are good, you can see right here, you can very clearly see that parting line witness. And I couldn't see it. I mean, I knew it was there, but I couldn't see it before I shot that black primer on it. The other thing that helps, and I mention this occasionally, it may sound like a weird thing, but the other thing that is helping me here is I have a really strong side light. You can't see it, but directly over there is a huge window. And that's one of my most powerful tools when it comes to doing finishing and body work, because that side light puts those things like, that little divot from clipping the sprue off a little too close into a relief because of the sideways light source producing that little tiny shadow. And overhead light won't do that for you. So if all you're working with is overhead light, it's really easy to miss stuff like this. And you don't see it until later on when it's too late. So I'm really fortunate that I've got this giant window to work next to. So now that I've shown you that issue, how am I going to deal with it? Okay, pretty simple. All right, this is just a matter of running a blade across here very lightly, and because it's just, it's almost not there, just scraping that down, and you can see that it goes away pretty quickly. But I did in fact clip that sprue gate off a little too close, and that can happen. And that's, I guess, one of the pitfalls of a really, really sharp pair of nippers. You get overconfident and you clip too close, and it leaves a little bit of a divot. Now, with these tanks, that's probably not going to be visible, but I don't want to take that chance. So I I'll come back to that and I'll show you how I'm going to fix that. Because again, it might not be really necessary, but it's the kind of thing that you just don't really want to take a chance with if you don't have to. So, and it's good to know how to fix stuff like that for those moments when it definitely will show and you don't have any choice. So I'll set that aside there for a second, and we'll come back to that. Now, the other place where I shot some primer is here in the inside of the fuselage. I did 1/2 of it, and everything came out pretty good. The places where I had to deal with those ejector pin marks don't look too bad at all. But you'll notice that I did a little bit of sanding in there. And why? If it all looked okay? Well, the truth is, I had just some little goobers in there, some little, bits of flurm, and you can see I left some right there. There's my powerful side light showing that off. And the reason I left those is because I'm going to show you how I deal with these kind of little goobers, which I can't tolerate. Little goobers like that in my paint will keep me up at night, and there's really no excuse for them. I mean, if you have them in your paint, it's because you either didn't see them or you just didn't care, and I do care. So, because I know when I go to photograph this later, I'm going to be taking pictures really close, and they're going to show. Yeah, well, maybe not on the inside of the cockpit on this one since it's going to be closed, but nonetheless, I like to fix these things just to make certain. And sometimes I will fix them even when I don't need to, like in the case of these that I've left here. Those aren't going to show. None of that's going to show, but I will fix them just because it's good practice. Again, for those times when you really don't have any choice. So how did I deal with that? All right. Introduction of another tool. All right. This is an Infini sanding sponge. These guys make a number of really cool things. They make these sponges. They make sponge sticks like these, which you'll see me use a lot. They make hard sanding boards like this one, which you probably won't see me use a 220, not on this thing. They just make great stuff. They've got these also, these small ones that are really useful. I love their stuff, and I can't really recommend them enough. They use a really high quality abrasive, and it's just good. It doesn't seem to clog as bad. It cleans out pretty well, and it's consistent. Like, I don't get a lot of scratching and gouging when I use their abrasives. So what I do for situations like this, because obviously getting down in between those ribs is a little bit of a challenge. So all I do is I take and I chop off a little tiny rectangular chunk of the sponge, and then I grab it with my gripper tweezers, and I now have a very powerful little sanding instrument. If the thing will focus, come on, there we go. So you can see that nice little sanding pad, and I've got a whole range of grits in my drawer. But I just know from experience that 800 is a pretty good compromise for a situation like this, because Mr. Surfacer sands real easily, and I didn't want to, there wasn't really any need to make a super fine finish on it, but I also didn't want to leave any sanding scratches. So 800 was a good pick for this. And so once I've got this little setup, it's really easy to be able to then go in here and just work the problem area. And you can do this before you prime, but primer, again, part of its job is to fill in imperfections, and so I generally don't try to do much sanding on something like this anyway before I prime. I mean, if it's obvious, yeah, sure, sand before you prime. But again, sometimes you need the primer to be your diagnostic tool so that you can see what you're up against. Like, I didn't see any of these little goobers that were stuck in the paint until after I primed. So it definitely did its job in that respect. So that should be pretty good. Let's take a look. And yep, looks pretty good. Definitely good enough for right there, because again, that's not going to show. And I really just wanted to demonstrate that. The other one, I decided to proactively sand a little bit in there. And you can see where I did a little bit of that. One trick that you can do when you have something that's a little bit fuzzy, you know, like this is a little fuzzy from using the fiberglass brushes on it, you can take a little bit of Tamiya extra thin, because its whole job is to melt plastic, right? So just take a little bit of Tamiya extra thin and just very lightly brush some on. You don't need a lot. You don't want to really flood it. But if you just do that and brush it on there, it will instantly get rid of any little fuzzies that may be left. And this is a trick that you can use when you're doing like rescribing. If your panel lines have a little bit of swarf left in them, you can use this trick to settle that down. So I think that these areas are about as good as they can be before priming. You can see I made a cursory pass at taking care of the place where I dropped a huge blob of extra thin before. But so I think this piece is basically ready to prime. And I'm going to do that on camera just so that we can talk a little bit about spray discipline. But I want to be efficient, and so before I shoot any more primer, there's a little bit of assembly work that I need to do. You can see I try to do assembly work before priming if I can. This is the seat. And by the way, as Spitfire kit seats go, I love this. This is 3 parts and just wonderfully engineered to just basically go together. I mean, it just went together really, really easily and nicely. I like that they didn't get crazy in the name of realism and make all of these separate parts the way some kit makers do, which at 1/48 to me is just not worthwhile. I mean, you could, I guess, argue that maybe the adjustment lever on the side there should be a separate piece, but it's all but invisible in the finished model. So yeah, I think this is smart. And it'll plug in very easily to this former right here. You can see the holes where it'll just plug right in there. But I don't want to go ahead and do that yet because I am going to end up probably hand painting the seat. I haven't decided yet what color this seat is going to be. Later Spitfires had that rust. Well, Spitfires all have a seat that's made out of a kind of a resin, a pressed resin material. It's not aluminum. And the later ones were all left in the natural finish, which is kind of a rust-colored material. But earlier Spitfires sometimes had were painted green, just like the rest of the interior, and some of them had a leather cover on them. But I think that's kind of what Tamiya is trying to represent here, but I'm not really sure yet if I want to do that. I'm also not really sure about that flare rack. That's that row of round things on the front of the seat there. Yeah, there's certainly some contention about when the flare racks appeared, how long they stayed, But one thing I've learned about Spitfires is as soon as you think you know the rules, yeah, you'll find an exception. Spitfires are just all over the map. So anyway, a couple of housekeeping things that I got to do before I move on. And those both are worth, I guess, I hope anyway, you guys taking a look at. I'm going to fix this little divot on this air tank. So this is extra thin CA, all right, and this is one of the only times that I use CA as a filler. Oh great, looks like my, of course, never fails. It is only clogged up now that I'm on camera and I want to actually use some of it, right? That's the way it goes. Alright, here's one of the things that these Zuron nippers actually are really good for. This is the kind of duty they get relegated to once you get really good sprue cutters. Okay, so yeah, I don't use CA as a filler very much, and I'll probably talk more about this further down the road when there's actually some filling, some real filling to do. But I don't use it that much because it's just generally, to me, it's just a pain in the ass. It's a lot harder than the surrounding plastic, and that can cause all kinds of problems when you're sanding it. So I just don't really care for it as a filling material. But this is one situation where it really is good. Okay, now this is another great tool. I'll try to call these out every time I whip out another tool. This is the glue looper from, that's the name of the company, Glue Looper. I think maybe even that's what it says on there. And you can see that it's just a photo etch piece with a little ring there. And the ring is what gathers up the glue, obviously. And yeah, I know you can use the end of a needle or a little wire loop, whatever. I've done all those things. But my favorite thing about the glue looper is not the loop itself. I mean, that's great. But it's the fact that I can put it in one of these cheapo X-Acto handles. And now I have a super precise instrument for putting glue where I want it, which in this case is right there in that divot. And the super thin stuff is nice for these kind of real shallow little fills where you really don't want to build up a lot of material, and then once you do, you don't have really much to sand down, and works great for, like, you know, if you got like little pits or whatever. So we'll let that sit there for a second, and let's take a look at this other thing that I already know about. So yeah, I was saying that I thought that this little thing that's down here in this cockpit piece, yeah, again, this is going to be hard to see. I should probably just take this off of the sprue. Where I had that remnant of the gate. Yeah, this is not going to want to focus. Yeah, well, I thought it was flush, but you can see very clearly not flush. So I'm going to need to fix that. I'm going to see if I can just scrape that down here using the same method that I showed you on the ejector pins. I really should have paid more attention to that before I glued this part in, but I confess that I was a little distracted and being a little casual, probably, because you're not going to see it in the finished product, and that may drive some of you crazy that I'm so cavalier about stuff that doesn't get seen. But look, man, people got things to do, and if I'm not if I don't have to spend time and energy taking care of fixing things that will never be visible, then I got time to do other things, right? Anyway, I'm just running my mouth while I fix this. Okay, so a little bit of scraping there, and hey, since I've got my handy dandy little sander right here that I can reach down in there, a little bit of quick sanding. Again, this is dumb. I really should have fixed this first, but I honestly did think it was flush. And it really mostly was. There was just enough disruption there of the surface to show, and so anyway, but that's pretty well got it taken care of now. You can see that. So anyway, I want to move on, and I think this probably is good to go now, this little thing here. So this is a great application of this sanding stick. So just a few swipes should be all it takes to level that off. And I won't know for sure until I shoot some primer on it again, but I think that'll be good. But you can see, now that I'm sanding on that just a little bit, that parting line wants to show up. And I'm going to just very carefully take care of that, because on the top of the bottles, if it's going to show up any place looking through the canopy glass, well, the top is probably where you'd see it. So anyway, I will finish cleaning that up later. No reason to torture you guys with any more of that. But before I can move on to doing some more primer, again, because like I said, I want to be efficient, and so I want to assemble these two pieces of the firewall. This one, and this one can go together, and then there's this piece here. That's the that are the rudder actuators that connect to the rudder pedals. That piece can go in there. This piece right here can probably go in as well. But before I can sandwich the two instrument panel parts together, I have to make the compass mount right here. And because it goes in between, you can see it goes in between those, and it's black as opposed to being green, and I could paint it separately, but it's also real easy to paint it in place with just a brush, just brush paint it, or I will just paint it. It'll already be black from primer, and I don't mind a part like that being hard black, so I may just put a little mask on it. I don't know, we'll see when we get there, but the point is I have to create that piece before I can assemble those two. And so that brings us to a little bit of discussion about photo etch. And so we've got this piece of it right here. Now, photo etch is generally going to be one of four materials. It's either going to be brass, which everybody's probably seen. Occasionally you'll see aluminum. Occasionally you'll see stainless steel. And then sometimes, especially in these tamiya kits, you'll see nickel silver. And the nickel silver stuff usually, and that may be what this is, I don't know. Nickel silver is usually really shiny like this, And nickel silver, oddly enough, is actually a copper alloy. In fact, some people consider it a subset of brass. It actually has no silver in it. But nickel silver can be, and usually is, super, super hard. It's a spring material that is often found in things like, watch springs and electrical contacts and stuff like that. And I think that's what this is, but I could be wrong. This may just be steel. We'll find out here pretty quickly when I go to cut this piece off. Now, let me talk for a second about. Okay, this is really soft. So I think this is probably just stainless steel because it's cutting so easily. And let's see what happens when I try to bend it, because that's the real telltale. If you get a piece of nickel silver photo etch, you cannot bend it, and it doesn't anneal. If you don't know, I'm sure most of you do, but annealing is the process of just heating a material up and then cooling it off to remove the heat treat. And the annealing really only applies to non-ferrous metals. If you're doing steel, ferrous metals, it's called normalizing. But either way, the result is the same. You turn it from being stiff and springy to being soft and malleable. And this stuff, whatever it's made of, clearly already is nice and bendable, and that's good. Means we don't have to mess with it, and that makes sense because you've got these photo etch seat belts on here, and you really don't want to have to do any annealing or anything with those to get them to form if you're going to use them. And I'm not certain yet if I'm going to use those. Probably not. We'll get to that later. Anyhow, let's talk about cutting parts off of a photo etch fret, because there's some bad advice out there. A lot of people insist that the best thing for cutting photo etch is a glass cutting board and a hobby knife, and it just makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end when people say that, because glass is rubbing a knife blade across glass is one of the fastest ways to take the edge off of it. It's a ceramic, and a whetstone that you use to sharpen a knife is a ceramic. So why would you want to use something that's just going to make your knife blade instantly dull when cutting the photo etch itself with a knife blade is already going to be pretty hard on it? So what do I use instead? All right, this is a little sheet of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene. This is the same stuff that that cutting boards you get, Walmart or whatever, are made out of. It's basically a totally inert polymer. It's used a lot in food service industries because no chemical will absorb into it. It's abrasion resistant. It's very, very tough. In other words, it makes a perfect cutting board, and that's why it's great in the kitchen, because no amount of botulinum bacteria or E. coli or whatever is ever going to soak into it like it can with a wood cutting board. So, it's you can cut it, or at least your knife blade will actually go into it a little bit, whereas with a glass cutting board, not at all. So, if you're going to use a knife blade, then this is this is the thing you should use. And this kind of photo etch this photo etch is really thin and soft, and so it cuts fairly well with a knife blade. You don't want to use something that's too soft as a cutting board, because you can bend the photo etch. And that's why people say, oh, use glass. Well, you don't have to worry too much about that if you use this material. But an even better thing, in my view, is these Xuron photo etch shears. This one product Xuron makes that I absolutely love. You can see these are the Xuron 9180 photo etch shears. They're basically just like little bitty tin snips, and they're fantastic. They will cut closer than a knife blade in most cases. It's just, you know, basically on to you as to how well you position and make your cut, but they're fantastic. I really like tools that keep me from having to do secondary operations, and one of those that I really hate having to do is file a nub off of a little bitty photo etch part after I separate it from the fret. So these little shears make that possible. But again, it's down to how well you line them up and make the cut. But if you do it successfully, you can see, there you go. There is a photo etch part that I almost got it. There's a little bit of a nub. But the good news is that is the part that's sandwiched between the two. See, there's just a little bit of nub on that one side. Didn't quite get it. And I would file that off, but I don't have to because that's the part that's sandwiched between the other two components, and so doesn't need to be. I don't have to worry about it. All right, so I'm going to set this aside for a bit. And let's now form this. Now, people talk about photo etch benders and how do you bend photo etch and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, sometimes you need a photo etch bender for sure. But most photo etch that I see, at least if it's well designed, is already made to be bent. See how that's got little cuts in it? That's because Tamiya has engineered it to bend along those lines, and you really can do it with your fingers. See how easy it is? There's really not any need to get fancy and go spend a bunch of money on some kind of a whiz-bang gizmo for this type of photo etch work. I have honestly rarely ever seen much with aircraft photo etch that required that. It does happen. I was doing some the other day where I did have to get out the bender. So one of those things is handy, but don't get the idea that you have to have one to do photo etch work. You just need some magnifiers and some good sharp tweezers and some patience, and there we go. That part is made. Just like that. So I'm going to sandwich that between. Okay, so I'm finishing up this little subassembly here, and I'm putting some glue on, and some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, Pattison, what the hell? You are gluing parts that already have a coat of paint on them. What's up with that? Well, this is one of the things that I love about lacquers and about extra thin, because they actually contain some of the same components. If you ever look at an ingredient list for lacquer thinner, you'll find things in it like acetone and butyl acetate. Well, extra thin is allegedly 50% acetone and 50% butyl acetate. So there you go. And what that means is that, especially if you are working with lacquer paint, that extra thin will blow right through it in most cases. I mean, unless you've got just a ridiculous amount on there, chances are pretty high enough for me anyway, that the extra thin, especially if you get a nice little shot of it in there, is going to melt through that layer of lacquer paint more than sufficiently to bond tiny little parts together. And so that's why I feel like I can confidently prime and even paint parts like this before I put them in place. And you'll see that when I start finishing up the cockpit subassembly and we start gluing in some of the little boxes that are going to get painted probably in the next segment. Okay, it's next day and it's time to wrap this segment up, and I apologize because I'm not actually going to get to the priming that I keep promising, but we will. It's just that this has already gone on long enough, and I want to finish off this little bit of assembly and photo etch discussion. Okay, so you saw where I assembled this together, and it looks nice and clean, and you can see why it'll be so easy to paint that little bracket black by hand after the thing has been sprayed. The rest of it's been sprayed interior green. So that little bit is done. Then we had this fun little step of adding these foot straps onto the rudder pedals. Now look, this is the sort of thing that's not going to show, and so I would totally understand if somebody said, whoa, I'm not dealing with that because these are tiny. But just like some of these things that I talk about with doing finishing and sanding work where it may not really be necessary because it's just good practice, so is this. So you should do it, and I did it, and here that is, and this gives me a good opportunity to demonstrate a little bit about photo etch. Okay, see, there you go. That is pretty damn tiny, but it is certainly possible to glue those on there. Tamiya makes it pretty easy for you, or as easy as it could be, by giving you some little pins and notches, and it all goes relatively well, relatively, you know, all things considered, given how dinky it is. Now, how do you bend those? All right. Now, this is one of the great things about Tamiya photo etch is that sometimes, and I will occasionally see this with other manufacturers, but not nearly enough, they give you some extra parts because they know this stuff is little bitty and you might lose it or screw it up. And see, there are some extras of part number 6. And so I can show you a couple of things. The wonderful snipping quality of these photo etch shears, and this is also a nice time to point out how much I appreciate Tamiya giving you enough room between the parts and the fret to get these shears in there. There's nothing more frustrating than some bullshit photo etch that's got such a narrow gap between the part and the fret that you can't get your nippers in there. Especially like on this last stupid kit that I was working on from Bell Kits, which is a Belgian model car kit thing. Not only was there not enough room to get nippers in there, but the photo etch was stainless steel and it was really hard. So, you know, totally going to trash your hobby knife if you have to use it. Anyway, so let me show you how to bend that. You need something that you can mash it down into. So I've just got this UMP buffing stick that's got a nice sponge on it, and but you can really use anything that gives you you know, a sort of a firm sponge. All right, then you need something round. Now you can argue that having something of constant diameter is better. And I suppose it is, but by using this tapered rat tail, I can always find the right diameter, and that's just kind of a guessing game. But point being is that you're going to just use that as your forming tool, and it's just a matter of taking it, and once you've decided what diameter you want or radius, then you're going to just mash it in there good and hard and roll it as much as you need to, not too much, as much as you need to get it to wrap around, as far around your mandrel as necessary, and then just like that you got your little wrapped part. And you can really do this with just about any type of photo etch where you've got to create something like that. So that's an extra, very cool. And so when you go to glue stuff like that on, one of the things that you almost will inevitably run into is getting a little extra, super glue on there. And that can happen even with something simple, like where I glued this flat piece to right here. And by the way, pay attention in the instructions, because there's two of these that look identical, but one of them's for canopy closed and the other one is for canopy open. Anyhow, get a little too much super glue or whatever, you need to be able to remove that very easily. You really need to keep some of this stuff around. All right, this is super glue debonder, and I think it's probably basically acetone, but maybe not quite as strong. I don't know. Some debonders will melt styrene. This stuff does not. So you put a little bit of it on a Q-tip or on a paintbrush, and you got any extra super glue where it doesn't need to be, you just scrub it off. And it's great because you can, get a really clean and tight looking assembly that way with your photo etch. The other thing that's good to have around if you're using any kind of super glue for anything is kicker. And I like this Zap kicker, but I don't always like to use it in the aerosol because that just gets everywhere. So after a really brilliant suggestion from one of our Scale Modelers Critique Group members, I took one of my old Tamiya extra thin bottles and filled it full of kicker, and now it's super easy to apply because you got the little brush. Just be careful, don't get the brush in the wet glue you're trying to kick, because that will obviously glue your brush bristles together. Real quick, another tool that's really handy, these wax pencils. You can get them just about any place, but I get them from UMP. These are nice for picking up little bits of photo etch and placing them precisely, because it's just sticky enough to where you can pick it up, place it, and get the job done and be very precise with your placement. Okay, last little thing. I got notified that the bolts that are on the back of the former, or on the front of the former, that go right behind the seat, that is this piece right here, that are for the armor plate that comes on later marks of Spitfire, are not supposed to be there. And in fact, when I checked the instructions, they do tell you right here in step 8, right there, to clip those off. You can see that there on the left. So just in another little demonstration of how good a set of this type of really sharp nippers are, I clipped all 4 of those off with those nippers. Super easy, super clean, super done. Just like this segment of this video build. Okay, so there you go. That was like 40 minutes, and I feel like that was a good stopping place on that one. But I promise, on part 3, there will actually be primer and paint. All right? I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Much love.